Welcome to part 3 of exposing the decades-long calculated strategy behind Israel's enmity toward Lebanon and its people. A violence that was never defensive, it was never incidental, it is and has always been foundational and deliberate. Today we discuss 1948, the year Israel was created. We confront the blood and terror that made its creation possible, and we expose what it did to Lebanon in that same year. This matters because it shows you that when Israel was barely created, it immediately attacked Lebanon, and no, not as a response, but as the starting point of its existence. It attacked Lebanon despite Lebanon's non-participation in the 1948 war, and it committed its most atrocious massacres in Lebanon when? After the ceasefire. Yes, in 1948, Israel carried out its worst massacres and deliberate destruction of civilian property in Lebanon after the ceasefire. And in 2025, look, Israel's deliberate destruction of civilian property and land took place after the ceasefire. This is not a cycle. It is a continuous doctrine of violence, and I will prove every word to you. Before I begin, I want to address something. To those who keep insisting that we focus on today instead of discussing the past, you cannot understand the stakes of today while remaining so ignorant of your own history. To those who want peace, you cannot build a working, lasting peace with an enemy whose modus operandi you actively deny. And to those hastily asking for solutions, if we do not agree on the problem, we cannot agree on the solution. And this series lays out the problem for you. So today we go back to 1948 to lay bare the blood and gore that made Israel's creation possible and to expose what the Israelis did to the Lebanese that same year, which is the very same modus operandi you see playing out today. 1948 is the year the truth was buried under the most sickening pile of lies. Zionists and their propaganda erase what really happened in 1948. They erase their massacres of civilians that preceded and provoked the war. They distort the war. They lie and claim Lebanon attacked Israel when Lebanon did not even participate in the war, and in fact went to great lengths to remain as passive as possible. And the worst part? They repeat these lies so relentlessly, so systematically, that even some Lebanese today have come to believe and repeat them. That's the colonizer rewriting the script that even the victims start parroting back. That's how deep Zionist propaganda runs. And if we don't rip it out at the root, it will keep festering in media and worse, in national memory. It is imperative to understand that Israel's violence is anything but reactive. It is ideological, structural, and too often unprovoked. Start by taking it straight from Benny Morris, the veteran Israeli historian, right-wing Zionist, and a pivotal reference on 1948. In his seminal book of that very title, when describing Israel's attack on Lebanon in 1948, he wrote, "It was an unprovoked Israeli aggression." Then added, "Carmeli's move into Lebanon was the first time the Israelis had crossed a recognized international frontier and invaded a sovereign Arab state. Yet it is unclear why it did so or how the decision was taken." Well, in this video, I will show you how the decision was taken and why, because it was anything but unclear. I'll begin by taking you through the decades of Zionist terror in Palestine, because without that context, one cannot fully understand why Israel extended north to attack Lebanon in 1948. And then I will describe in detail the unprovoked attack of Israel on Lebanon. So let's cut out the vile propaganda. It is our duty to pursue the truth relentlessly in the name of a nation determined to be truly sovereign. Let's lay the truth bare with receipts. Here's your data. The way the discourse around Israel's creation is framed almost always begins on May 15, 1948. That single date represents 4 things. 1, day 1 of Israel's existence after its so-called independence on May 14. 2, the day Palestinians mark as a Nakba, the catastrophe of their own dispossession, expulsions and mass killings, the direct price of Israel's creation. 3, the day when the last British High Commissioner departed Palestine, officially ending the corrupt British mandate, and 4, the official start of what historians call the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, when some neighboring Arab states formally entered the conflict with Israel. The problem with this date is that most people act as if history began the day Israel was created, erasing everything that came before. Even anti-Zionists, when referring to Palestinian historical suffering, often speak of the past 77 years, as if it all started in 1948. But that framing erases the brutal reality. The decades of massacres and terror carried out by Zionist militias before May 15, 1948. Israel did not suddenly emerge and then begin its crimes. For Israel to be created at all, it had already waged an egregious campaign of ethnic cleansing and massacres well before Israel was officially established on May 15. May 15 was not the beginning of the violence, it was the culmination of it. And it is very important to understand that, because if we think the violence began on May 15, we mistake Israel's crimes as reactions to a war instead of what they truly were, the premeditated foundation of the state itself. The roots of Zionist violence go back to the 1920s and hardened in the 1930s. And it was all deliberately enabled by the British, who funded, armed, and protected the rise of settler Jewish militias that grew more militarized each year, raiding villages, seizing land, and bombing Arab markets, buses, and homes. As British military historian Matthew Hughes writes in his book Britain's Pacification of Palestine, the British had been arming Jewish settlements since the early 1920s. And in due time, they trained, paid for, and equipped more Jewish auxiliary police and paramilitary units that directed even more violence towards the Palestinians. And almost none of these Zionists, whose terrorism was organized and financed by the British, were local. They were almost all imported European immigrants. And this is critical to understand. At the turn of the century, Jews made up only 3 or 4% of Palestine's population, the majority being local, Arabic-speaking, part of the Palestinian social fabric. But under British rule, after the Balfour Declaration and the invention of Zionism, that number exploded from 3% to 33%. That's a 40-fold increase. That's 4,000%. That was not natural growth. It was engineered settler colonialism. And 95% of the Jews who settled the land in that period, from 1919 to 1946, were European, most often arriving not as neighbors, but as armed paramilitary settlers, trained and shielded by the British, violently remaking the land to carve out an ethno-state on someone else's land that they would come to call Israel. Israel was manufactured by the West, engineered by the British Empire, and populated through the mass importation of European Jewish settlers armed by the British. Now, if you were wondering about Palestinian violence, it certainly existed, but it was rare, fragmented, and reactive. In fact, historians who combed through the archives confirm it. The violence was overwhelmingly Zionist. Benny Morris admits the Zionists encountered little Arab violence in the first 2.5 decades of settlement. And Thomas Suarez, in his meticulously documented book State of Terror, also writes, Palestinian reprisals were minuscule in comparison to the Israeli aggression precipitating it. And the reason their reprisals were minuscule is because they were violently denied the right to self-defense by the colonizers. To quote Thomas Suarez again, the British response to Palestinian terror was brutal and uncompromising. Suspects were summarily hung, hundreds of houses of innocent people demolished. The British systematically terrorized, disarmed, and repressed Palestinians, while at the same time arming, training, and legitimizing European Zionist militias who worked with the British in unleashing terror on the Palestinian people. Matthew Hughes writes in his peer-reviewed academic paper titled Terror in Galilee, British-Jewish Collaboration, tough, often brutal, exemplary action was standard military counter-insurgency practice for the British soldiers against local civilians and insurgents, and then passed on to Jewish soldiers training and fighting with the unit. The British trained Zionist militias to codify methods of terror into military doctrine, arming Jewish recruits and embedding them directly into death squads. Yes, one notorious example, the Special Night Squads were joint British-Jewish literal death squad units of the 1930s, referred to as well-oiled killing machines, led by British officer Ord Wingate, who were created to terrorize entire villages through night raids, torture, collective punishment, and public executions. It reads like something out of a horror novel, and I will quote Matthew Hughes again. The terror inflicted by the SNSs was of classical proportions. One favored method used by British and Jewish soldiers alike was that of the Roman legions, decimation. The Jews executed every 8th male villager. Braden killed every 15th man, or he would kill every 10th man. Jewish supernumerary officers lined up the men and shot every 8th man after not getting rifles. The Jews then said that they would return and kill everyone. This is from 1938, 10 years before Israel was created. Their methods were cruel beyond comprehension. There are also documented accounts of Palestinians being lined up and forced to wash their faces with a layer of the earth consisting of burning oil mixed with the stones and dirt. They were also forcing sand into villagers' mouths, and they whipped all the villagers. This was not warfare. This was pure terrorism and ritualized sadism, carried out hand in hand by the British Army, its Jewish auxiliaries, and Jewish militias. And this is the foundation Israel was built on. Side note, all of this was happening before the European Holocaust began in 1939. Zionism was never a refuge from Europe's crimes. It was a settler colonial project launched and enforced through terror years before the Nazi Holocaust. And the proof that those Zionist terrorists didn't care about the Holocaust is damning, because those very Zionist terrorists wanted to ally themselves with the Nazis in the middle of the Holocaust. Benny Morris himself admits, at the end of 1940, the LHI Leahy tried to establish an alliance with Nazi Germany. But Berlin was uninterested. The Irgun also sought ties with Mussolini's fascist Italy. Imagine! At precisely the same time, Jews in Europe were being rounded up, starved, enslaved, and murdered in ghettos and camps by the Nazis. The Jewish terrorists in Palestine were seeking an alliance with the Nazis while claiming Israel was the only response to Nazism. I mean, don't be too shocked. In the same spirit, in March 2025, just a few months ago, Israel welcomed far-right European leaders tied to Nazi-rooted movements, the descendants of the very ideology that sought to annihilate Jews, and recast them as allies in a conference on anti-Semitism, while it is committing a genocide. Even CNN couldn't whitewash this. Israel embraces France's far right, turning a blind eye to its Nazi past. Israel was not born from or for the Holocaust. It exploited the Holocaust to accelerate a genocidal colonial project already in motion by European Jewish terrorists. And let me be clear, the label Jewish terrorists is not mine. It comes from the record. The United Nations designated the Irgun and the Leahy as notorious terrorists. The US government called them Jewish terrorist organizations in Palestine, and the British government flatly called them Jewish terrorists. The same terrorists who, never forget, declared war in 1937 against the very British Empire that had opened the gates of Palestine to them, armed them, and made their presence possible only for them to turn their guns on their own enablers. Yes, in time, I will also show you that Zionists don't just betray neutrality, they also wipe out their allies. And these Jewish terrorist organizations did not dissolve. They became the very building blocks of Israel's army and its governments. The very commanders and killers from these terrorist organizations rose to become Israel's prime ministers, ministers of defense, ministers of foreign affairs, and senior officials. You can pause and read the names of some of those terrorists who became so-called Israeli statesmen. Every name, every title is tied to massacres and expulsions, and all are of European descent. These terrorists never stopped mandating the killing of civilians in the region throughout their time in power. In the late 1930s, when the Arab Revolt came, the British crushed Palestinian armed resistance so thoroughly that by 1947-1948, Palestinians were effectively defenseless, while the Zionists had fully armed, trained militias. In 1948, after a reign of terror, decades of Jewish terrorism culminated in a final extermination plan called Plan Dalet. Dalet being the Hebrew letter D, Plan D. It was a plan to isolate, to purify, and to destroy Arab villages, and it was carried out in March, April, and May of 1948 by the Zionists before a single Arab army had attacked. During this period, Zionist militias carried out systematic expulsions and massacres, seizing Arab villages and towns under the British eye, villages that lay in the territory designated in the UN Partition Resolution for Arab Sovereignty. This proves they never intended to respect the UN Partition Plan. It was a blueprint for mass expulsion, for ethnic cleansing, for terror against a completely unarmed civilian population.
Benny Morris counted 28 massacres, of which Tantura is only one. So it's not an isolated episode.
And this includes the infamous Deir Yassin massacre of April 9, where, as per the Israelis themselves, they piled bodies and burned them. Palestinians were tied to trees and set on fire, and children were lined up against a wall and shot with a submachine gun. Never forget three things about Deir Yassin. It had a non-aggression pact with the Zionists, a literal pact of neutrality. 2, geographically, it was placed firmly in the Arab-designated zone of the UN Partition Plan. And 3, it was, in Benny Morris's words, militarily insignificant. Deir Yassin declared neutrality, lay outside the UN-designated Jewish state, posed no security threat, yet the Zionists raped, burned, and butchered its civilian population anyway. All this was before May 15, before Israel officially existed, before the 1948 war broke out. Thoughts and prayers to our friends out there who believe that neutrality means anything to Zionists other than ending up in a mass grave. And the commander of this massacre, roaming free, wears the butchery of Deir Yassin as a badge of honor.
עד היום, אף שלי בשמיים. לו היו אז עוד 3-4 דיר יסיני בארץ ישראל, לא היה נשאר אף ערבי אחד בארץ. עד שיכול להגיד את זה בגללו. אני פיקדתי על דיר יסין.
Do you understand that borders and sovereignty and neutrality and pacts and agreements and the sanctity of Arab life don't mean anything to Zionists? Wait until I get to Lebanon. Now, why did the Zionists commit so many massacres before May 15? Because that was the day the British were leaving, and the world might start paying attention. So in that window, while they still had British protection, with no resistance to stop them, they accelerated the slaughter, seizing Arab-designated land under the UN partition plan that they blackmailed into existence, proving that they never intended to respect it. And they committed one of the most brutal, premeditated ethnic cleansing campaigns in modern history to baptize a state in blood. In 1948, the Israelis eradicated 530 Palestinian villages. Look at this map. Every red dot marks a Palestinian village erased, displacing 750,000 people. That's what they want you to forget. And that's exactly why we're talking about it. And that day came to be known as a Nakba, the catastrophe. But for Zionists, they dressed it up as Independence Day, as if the massacres of innocent people and the violent seizure of another people's land could ever be the down payment for statehood. By the time the Arab states intervened on May 15, 1948, it was too late. The Zionists had already created irreversible facts on the ground, ensuring their ethnic cleansing conquest could not be undone. But that is where Zionists love to pretend that history begins, as if history only starts once they can frame it as self-defense. The myth of self-defense, pure fiction, because the fighting was taking place almost entirely on land that the UN partition plan had allocated to the Arabs. Another myth, that of David versus Goliath, pure fiction too. Zionists love to spread the lie that they were attacked by 5 Goliath massive Arab armies and that they stood as the outnumbered yet plucky underdogs. But every serious Israeli historian admits the complete opposite. The Arab armies invaded with shockingly few forces. By May 15, the combined Arab armies fielded at most 20,000 combat troops. The Zionists, by contrast, had 29,677 fighters already mobilized. These figures come from Israeli sources, but those are frontliners. Palestinian historian Walid Khalidi notes that once reserves are counted, Zionist forces reach 60,000 to 70,000, outnumbering Arab armies by a factor of 5 to 1 on the first day of the war. And by the new year, the Israelis had 108,000 frontliners, while Arab forces peaked just at 68,000. But no matter the number, it is widely agreed, as Benny Morris wrote, the Arab armies were much smaller and severely under-equipped. So who were these Arab armies? They were Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. Saudi Arabia had a token contingent. What about Lebanon? What about Lebanon? Most literature you read about 1948 barely mentions Lebanon, in fact, puts us with everybody. A passing reference, a footnote at best, hardly ever stating the incredibly important details of Lebanon's role in 1948. Especially the Lebanese don't know their own history. They don't know we stayed out of the war. But history books exist for a reason, so let's turn to them. First, we turn to Benny Morris. Listen to this. Lebanon opted out of the invasion. On 14 May, President Bashar al-Khoury and his Army Chief of Staff, General Fuad Shahab, decided against Lebanese participation. Colonel Adil Shahab, commander of the Army's 1st Regiment, designated to cross into Israel, apparently refused to march. The Lebanese parliament, after bitter debate, ratified the decision the same day. He goes on to say, Lebanon decided to deploy its army defensively inside its own borders. Well, I'm going to show you that Lebanon not only opted out of the invasion, but it went to great lengths to be passive, even as it struggled to appear brave in front of the fellow Arabs who were fighting the genocidal monstrosity that is Israel. To save face politically, Lebanon only allowed a small Arab Liberation Army ALA unit, a volunteer force created by the Arab League and composed mostly of non-Lebanese fighters, to cross into northern Galilee on May 15, 1948. The area they entered was still Palestinian territory and under the UN partition plan was clearly designated as Arab land. This was a symbolic gesture meant to demonstrate alignment with the broader Arab war effort, a move historian Benny Morris describes as done merely to cover itself politically. The Lebanese army itself not only remained on a defensive inside of its borders, but it even tried to compel Arab forces to withdraw from Palestinian territory, which could have been seen as scandalous treason. The Lebanese army ordered Al-Qawqji, the commander of the Arab Liberation Army, to withdraw from Israeli territory, but to no avail. That's as per Benny Morris. Matthew Hughes, writing in his chapter Collusion across the Litani, Lebanon, and the 1948 war in the Cambridge University Press volume, The War for Palestine. He also documents this telegram from Qawuqji to al-Wazir, a key figure in the Arab Higher Committee, the main political body representing Palestinians under British rule. So this is preserved in the Qawuqji Papers, IPS File 11, revealing that the Lebanese army insisted that it, the ALA, avoid battle at its borders. The evidence of Lebanese neutrality gets more damning. Not only did it remain in position on its side of the border, where it was instructed to fight only if forced to reply to Jewish attacks, but even when Israeli forces occupied villages on the Lebanese side of the border, the Lebanese army did nothing. And that certainly caught the attention of the Israelis. As per a former colonel in Israeli military intelligence, Reuven Ehrlich, the Lebanese army took special care to avoid combat with IDF, even on Lebanese territory. Historians even agree that Lebanon's role in the 1948 war was not merely minor, it was strategically beneficial to Israel. The Lebanese army contributed no effective military pressure, allowing Israel to secure its northern flank with minimal forces and redirect its military strength elsewhere. The insignificant, operationally flawed performance of the Lebanese army and the ALA was a tremendous strategic asset for the Israelis. Due to a lack of threat, the Zionists could shift troops across theaters at will, winning local superiority with no effort and executing short, decisive offensives in Galilee throughout 1948. The only direct Lebanese army engagement occurred on June 5-6, when for half a day, it briefly helped the ALA and a Syrian battalion recapture the Palestinian town of Al-Malikiya, located approximately 200 meters from the Lebanese border, which is a 2-minute walk from our border, or a 19-second run if you are Usain Bolt. Quoting Morris again, the Lebanese success at Al-Malikiya marked their only real participation in the war, after which they withdrew voluntarily before any truce. Who withdraws when they're victorious? Apparently the Lebanese army does, handing the village over to the ALA and resuming its defensive position within its own borders, refusing to engage any further. The Lebanese army never launched a full-scale invasion. It never formally declared war on Israel. It never sought to hold territory, and it remained largely uninvolved. For those who would like another source, here is renowned military historian Matthew Hughes again, writing in Collusion Across the Litani. It, Lebanon, fought one insignificant symbolic half-day battle at the border village of Al-Malikiya in June 1948, advancing a short distance into Israel/Palestine before settling down to await the outcome of the war. The reason is they wanted to fend off possible criticism of Lebanese non-participation in the pan-Arab effort. If you want to say, well, technically, it kind of counts as participation. No. Even Israeli intelligence, the HIS Haganah intelligence services, admitted the Lebanese army did not join the invasion as its main forces were concentrated between Tyre and Ras al-Na'ura to the west. Another Israeli agent also said, General Shahab refused to invade Palestine and argued that his army is only a defensive army and incapable of offense. Furthermore, the Lebanese army was purposely uncooperative with other Arab forces. Let's quote the report by the IDF Chief of Operations to press correspondents in 1948, as well as Tzadok Eshel's book, The Carmeli Brigade and the War of Independence. Both sources cited by Matthew Hughes in his publication, Lebanon's Armed Forces in the Arab-Israeli War, Journal of Palestine Studies. The quote goes, Lebanon did very little to help the ALA. The ALA had no direct support from the Lebanese army, and the Israelis were clearly aware of Lebanon's passivity. Lebanon was so cautious about maintaining a posture of non-engagement, of passivity, to quote the Israelis, that on 8th of June 1948, its army chief issued an order that effectively prevented Mujahideen fighters from entering Lebanon from Palestine, Israel. So let's clearly recap. Lebanon flat out rejected participation in the war. Its army launched no offensive, not even token resistance. It withheld support from its Arab allies fighting Israel. It even encouraged them to withdraw from what was not even Israel yet. It did not allow fighters to enter Lebanon from Palestine. Its only advance outside of its territory was a 2-minute walk into Palestine and a token 200-meter push for half a day, which they willingly abandoned after victory before any truce was even reached. It deliberately avoided combat with the Zionists, even on its own territory, as confirmed by Israeli intelligence, and it allowed Israelis to secure the entire Galilee, the entire north. Sounds to me like Israel owed a debt of survival to Lebanon. So tell me, did Israel stop at Lebanon's border out of respect for its sovereignty? Did it say, these are our neutral, passive neighbors. We respect their neutrality and sovereignty? Answer me. Did Israel respect Lebanon's neutrality and sovereignty? At barely 5 months old, Israel full-on invaded Lebanon. It's called Operation Hiram, an outright insult to the Lebanese people. Hiram was the Phoenician king of Tyre, a city in southern Lebanon. According to biblical tradition, Hiram allied with King Solomon to build the first temple in Jerusalem, supplying cedar, wood, gold, and skilled artisans. By naming its 1948 military campaign against Lebanon after him, Israel was making a symbolic claim over Lebanon, as if to suggest that Lebanon, like ancient Tyre, was destined to serve Israel via a biblical and Zionist vision. This erasure and appropriation of Lebanese history is part of Israel's settler colonial logic. Not only do they steal the land, but they attempt to rewrite history to justify their violence, portraying their invasions as part of some historical continuity, where Lebanon is merely an extension of their so-called biblical claims. This wasn't just an invasion, it was a massacre. Villages were emptied, civilians were executed, and survivors were expelled or terrorized into fleeing. And the plan was not spontaneous. It was planned. Ben-Gurion was openly speaking about annexing South Lebanon since mid-May. Remember Chaim Weizmann's map submitted in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference? We covered this in part 2. This was the map. And this is South Lebanon. These people were never vague about their ambitions. Quoting Morris, already in mid-May, Ben-Gurion had spoken of conquering southern Lebanon. And they did, in October 1948. Let us continue reading Benny Morris. Around midnight, 30-31 October, Carmeli, the Israeli military unit that led Operation Hiram, crossed the frontier into southern Lebanon and occupied a string of 15 mostly Shiite villages between the Panhandle's western border and Wadi Duba, Wadi Saluqi, from Alman and Deir Syrian along the Litani River in the north to Khantara and Al-Qusair, in the west to Meis al-Jabal and Blida in the south. The Lebanese army faded away, and the villagers welcomed the Israelis, some of them signing surrender instruments, others asking to be annexed by Israel. Indeed, many villages west of Wadi Duba contacted the IDF and asked to surrender. Early on 31 October, Israel agreed to a ceasefire, which went into effect at 11 a.m. Let's strip away the deceitful language and call this what it is. Israel invaded a sovereign country that had not attacked it, had not threatened it, had not even participated in the war. It stormed across the Lebanese border, occupied 15 villages, and forced civilians into submission, civilians who had not only not put up a fight, but had welcomed them and surrendered to them. 11 hours later, they agreed to a ceasefire. Remember what I told you about Israeli ceasefires earlier? That it is a continuous doctrine of violence? Fun fact, the same villages they attacked in 1948, they are bombing again right now under a so-called ceasefire. So they agreed to a ceasefire. Yet the next day, November 1, 1948, Israel carried out one of its most notorious massacres in Lebanon, Hula. This massacre was committed after the ceasefire. This is the Hula massacre as described in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper. In 1948, during the War of Independence's Operation Hiram, the soldiers of the Carmeli Brigade took over the Hula village in Lebanon. The commander was Shmuel Lahis, 22. Lahis reported that the village had been taken without a fight and that most of its residents had fled. He added that about 35 men, that's not an accurate number by the way, there were more, remained in the village and that he had put them all in a building. The company commander and sergeant major shot them all with a machine gun and then blew up the house on them so that they could have a mass grave. These people who were killed were not soldiers. They were civilian captives who had not put up a fight, unarmed boys and men. Lahis was convicted of murder by the Israeli court, but what did Israel do? The court sentenced him to 7 years in prison, reduced to 1 year after an appeal. President Weizmann, the same Weizmann from the map, revoked Lahis's punishment, and President Ben-Zvi granted him a pardon. In 1978, Lahis was named president of the Jewish Agency. Did you hear what I just said? Do you know what the Jewish Agency is? The Jewish Agency is the largest Jewish NGO in the world, responsible for Jewish immigration to Palestine, a pillar of the settler colonial project. It was led by a man who had personally overseen the execution of innocent Lebanese civilians, including children, and turned their corpses into rubble. It is not a detail when I say that terrorists and murderers form the backbone of Israeli leadership. This is not an overstatement. This is the foundation of Israel. Now look at this. This is the memorial stone in Hula, commemorating 67 men and boys murdered that day, some as young as 12 years old, maybe even younger. And this is the same memorial stone vandalized by Israeli forces in November 2024, 76 years later. They left a message, written in Hebrew. When transliterated, it comes out as a rhyme. She gever ze she bekever. A Shiite man is a Shiite in the grave. And they signed it, Golani. Let that sink in. It's a play on the very well-known Israeli phrase, Aravi tov ze Aravi met, which means a good Arab is a dead Arab. It's a famous Israeli death chant that asserts that the only good Arab is one that they've killed. This is not just graffiti. It is a continuation of historical psychotic violence, symbolically affirming the ideology that led to the massacre in the first place. The phrase directly targets Shia Lebanese, reducing their identity to death. It suggests that the only place for a Shia man is in the grave, implying genocidal intent. It indicates an active endorsement of the killing of Shia civilians, linking past massacres to present military action. This is not an isolated incident of vandalism. It is a political statement from Israeli soldiers, reinforcing historical patterns of war crimes, impunity, and disregard for Lebanese lives and Lebanese sovereignty. It reflects an ongoing ideology where massacres are not only justified, but glorified. This is not just hate. This is a genocidal ideology carved into military culture, policy, and action, and they're glorifying it. But to fully grasp the sickness of this, we need to look at the past, because once the Shia of southern Lebanon were anything but hostile. And I want to read you an excerpt that might move you. The Shiites of southern Lebanon, generally friendly with the Jewish settlements across the border, also appear to have had misgivings about the jihad against the Jews. Let that sink in. The Shiites didn't even want to go to war. There was no enmity, no provocation, only coexistence. And it was betrayed, just like every other trust extended to Zionism. Today in Hula, as part of the ongoing occupation of South Lebanon by Israel, the Israelis have built an illegal Israeli base in Hula. Did you know this? In 1948, they butchered the people of Hula in a massacre so grotesque it should have seared their shame into stone. Instead, decades later, they mock the memory of the dead with genocidal vandalism. And today, they sit on the same soil with an illegal military base the occupation made concrete. It tells you everything. For Israel, a massacre is never the end, and it is never wrong. The dead are mocked, the land is seized, and the wound is kept open so they can drive the knife in again and again, generation after generation. You think it's just a curse reserved for the Shiites? No, Habibi, it's not. In their 1948 invasion, the Israelis did not just murder Shias or Muslims, they also murdered Christians. Let's read Benny Morris again. Hula was just one of a series of atrocities committed by the Golani 7th and Carmeli Brigades and auxiliary units in the course of Hiram and in its immediate aftermath. Altogether, some 200 civilians and prisoners of wars were murdered in about a dozen locations. The haphazardness of the killings, Christians as well as Muslims were murdered. In some sites, 2 or 4 persons were killed, in others 50 or 80. Given the number and concentration of the atrocities and the diversity of the units involved, there are grounds for suspecting that the field commanders involved believed that they were carrying out an authorized policy, probably designed to precipitate flight. What is he saying? This was all planned for ethnic cleansing. Remember this quote from Benny Morris that I read earlier, listing some of the Lebanese villages invaded by Israeli forces in 1948? I want to show you something. I put them on a map with a little animation that I created. I'm going to read the quote again as you watch the animation. The Israelis occupied a string of 15 mostly Shia villages between the Panhandle's western border and Wadi Duba, Wadi Saluqi, from Alman and Deir Sirian in the north to Qantara and Al-Qusayr, in the west to Mays al-Jabal and Blida in the south. And this is Hula. And look, I drew a teeny tiny detail so you can understand where the Israelis were going. This is called the Litani River. On page 344, Carmel has contacted Yadin, who apparently called Ben-Gurion, who gave the go-ahead. Carmel, according to his later testimony, was motivated by the consideration that the Litani River and Wadi Duba afforded natural, defensible boundaries for Israel. Israel invaded Lebanon because it wanted to draw its borders using the north of the Litani River as a natural frontier. Remember this map submitted in 1919? You think it was fiction? Natural, defensible boundaries for Israel. The Zionist logic of expansionism is always cloaked in security language. Annex what you can under the guise of defense and then call it a natural frontier. This river, called the Litani, is quietly flowing while the Lebanese nation sleeps beside it. The fact that we, the Lebanese, have abandoned the gold coursing through our nation's veins is not just a tragedy. It is one of the greatest betrayals we've inflicted on ourselves. And that brings me to my favorite chapter in Israel's envy with Lebanon, water, and their pathological obsession with the Litani. and today with our natural gas. It will burn your eyes with rage when you see it clearly. But that's your story for next time. For now, I'll end with this. Remember the scathing words written by Benny Morris that I read in the introduction? Karmeli's move into Lebanon was the first time the Israelis had crossed a recognized international frontier and invaded a sovereign Arab state, yet it is unclear why it did so or how the decision was taken. Is it still unclear? You see, this exposes the hypocrisy and willful blindness in how Israeli aggression is framed, even by historians. How is it that when Zionist forces, in the middle of one of contemporary history's most brutal ethnic cleansing campaigns, storm across a recognized international frontier, occupy a territory that they've openly coveted for decades, massacre civilians, the motives are suddenly unclear? Israel's motives were never unclear. They wanted more land without the indigenous inhabitants. We've seen them do it for decades in Palestine, and Lebanon has not been an exception to that rule. And look, only a few lines later, Morris contradicts this so-called uncertainty by saying the Israelis wanted the area. This was never about defense, and it still is not. It was about expansion, occupation, and control, and it still is. The real tragedy is not that Morris hesitates to say it outright. The tragedy is that we, the people whose land was invaded and whose civilians were continuously massacred, are still forced to struggle to convince the world and even our own compatriots that we are a nation harassed daily, coveted for our land, our water, our natural gas, robbed of our resources, and killed without pause. The fact that massacres, forced displacement, and blatant violations of sovereignty are constantly excused, downplayed, or treated as some unsolvable mystery is not just insulting, it's dangerous. And those who do that make you forget your history, as some start bowing down to their revisionism. It's the same revisionist drivel pushed by those amongst us who claim, if you don't bother Israel, Israel won't bother you, a lie so absurd that even Israeli right-wing historians do not even parrot. And those who still parrot that delusion, this is not just ignorance, it is complicity. They are part of the ongoing cover-up of Zionist crimes, crimes so undeniable that even Israeli historians and Israeli filmmakers have been unable to ignore them and have documented them, and yet some of our compatriots from within still deny them. And it has never, ever stopped. Just recently, Amnesty International published a report on August 26, 2025, which has documented the extensive and deliberate destruction of civilian property and agricultural land by Israel in South Lebanon, including homes, mosques, cemeteries, roads, parks, soccer fields, schools, and clinics. Flattened. And that is when Israeli forces already controlled the areas. The report said that much of the destruction took place after 27 November 2024, after a ceasefire agreement went into effect. That places the damage outside active combat, which violates international humanitarian law, and qualifies these acts as war crimes, because as per Amnesty International, there was and still is no imperative military necessity justifying such widespread destruction. The pattern is unchanged. They massacred Hula under a ceasefire in 1948. They committed documented war crimes under the ceasefire again in 2024 and 2025. 77 years apart, the method is identical because the violence is permanent. The sadism is never ending. Nothing changes with this enemy, who is committing genocide. With Israel, ceasefire means slaughter, and peace is just another form of occupation. So I will leave you with this. There is a timeless truth drawn from the crucible of ancient warfare, most famously captured in Sun Tzu's The Art of War. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. That's where the adage, know your enemy, comes from. But Lebanon today neither knows its enemy nor truly knows itself. And in that ignorance lies the root of its vulnerability. Because the battle here is not necessarily a military one. It is the battle for sovereignty and dignity. This video is not just a message, it's a mirror and a map. A mirror to confront who we are, and a map to understand what we face. If you take anything away, let it be this. Knowledge is not a luxury. It is a weapon. And in a land of shadows, where the enemy betrays trust so completely, repays hospitality with massacre, and sustains its very existence through perpetual violence, the first act of sovereignty is to see clearly. Because those who do not see clearly cannot stand firmly, and those who do not stand firmly do not survive. Onwards and upwards.